Hi, this is History with me, Dan. Pratt Street, located in downtown Hartford, Connecticut, stands out in a lot of ways. At a little over 600 feet, it's only a block long, but in the mid-20th century, it was sometimes described as Hartford's Fifth Avenue. That's because of the many specialty shops that flourished here at the time. The tenants have changed over the years, but Pratt Street continues to be home to numerous small businesses. Made pedestrian only in 2020, Pratt Street has been experiencing renewed vitality in the wake of revitalization efforts. In this video, I'll talk about the history of Pratt Street. Unlike many other parts of downtown Hartford, where entire sections of the historic streetscape were wiped out for 20th century redevelopment, Pratt Street retains a more intimate atmosphere and is lined with many 19th and early 20th century structures. I'll start by talking about Society for Savings, which is a well-known Pratt Street landmark. Then I'll turn to the north side of the street to discuss the now lost Hartford Female Seminary, where a young Harriet Beecher Stowe once taught. Then I'll talk about other buildings on the north side of the street, as well as the big influence that the Wise Smith department store had in developing Pratt Street in the early 20th century. I'll end by talking about buildings west of Society for Savings on the south side of the street. As you watch the video, if you are enjoying it, please hit the like button. And if you want more content like this, please hit the subscribe button. Pratt Street, shown here in a section of the plan of the City of Hartford of 1824, had been laid out a decade earlier in 1814 through the farm of John Pratt. The street connects Main Street to the east with Trumbull Street to the west. As with many areas downtown that would later be commercialized, Pratt was once a residential street, even as commercial buildings sprung up at the corners with Main and Trumbull Streets. For a long time, the rest of Pratt Street continued to consist of single-family homes built in the early 19th century. This depiction of Pratt Street is from the 1869 Atlas of Hartford and Tolland counties. Houses still dominated the street, but some of these were now used as boarding houses. In the 1870s and 80s, dressmakers and milliners came to dominate the street, as many started their businesses in residential buildings. In the 1880s and 90s, there would be a boom of commercial construction. But this 1869 atlas notes only 3 non-residential entities. The first of them, located on the south side of Pratt near Main Street, is labeled Savings Bank. This was in fact Society for Savings. Chartered in 1819, it was Connecticut's first mutual savings bank. After putting up with inadequate quarters downtown for its first decade and a half, Society for Savings erected its first dedicated building on Pratt Street in 1834. The facade of this one-story building was designed by the Society's first president, Daniel Wadsworth, who also founded the Wadsworth Athenaeum and provided the design for Center Church in Hartford. Although the institution was called Society for Savings, for clarity, the words Savings Bank appeared above the front entrance, and the society was long known as the Pratt Street Bank. By the time of this 1869 atlas, the 1834 building had been replaced by a larger 2-story brownstone structure built in 1860. That second building would in turn be replaced by the Society's third and even more imposing building in 1893. That building survives today at 31 Pratt Street. Its elaborate neoclassical facade, originally designed by George H. Gilbert of Hartford, has been much altered over the years. The ground floor front features 3 arched sections, and originally the entrance was in the one on the left. But during renovations in 1926-7 by the New York firm of Dennison and Heerens, the entrance was moved to the middle of the 3 sections. It was during this same renovation that the building's current grand interior was installed. It's now used as the wedding and event venue called the Society Room of Hartford. The exterior of the Society for Savings building above the ground floor was even more drastically altered a quarter century later in the International style by S.F. Jeter and Associates of Hartford. Returning to the 1869 Atlas, we'll move west down Pratt Street and cross to the north side closer to Trumbull Street to a building the Atlas labels as Female Seminary. This was the Hartford Female Seminary, a school for girls established in 1823 by Catherine Beecher with her sister Mary Beecher Perkins. They were the sisters of author Harriet Beecher Stowe, as well as suffragist Isabella Beecher Hooker and their 7 preacher brothers, including the abolitionist Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. Catherine Beecher was an educator and author of domestic advice books and was known as an advocate for women's education, although, unlike her sister Isabella, she did not support women's suffrage. In 1826, the school's enrollment had reached 100, after initially occupying a single room at the corner of Main and Kinsley Streets, and then the basement of Horace Bushnell's North Church on Main Street. The seminary moved into a new Greek Revival-style building on Pratt Street. Most sources date the building to 1827, although a Hartford Courant article in 1888 indicates that that was the year the seminary was incorporated and that the building was erected the following year. Catherine's sister Harriet, who would go on to write the anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, taught at the school from 1829 until 1832. That was when both sisters headed west with other members of their family, led by their father, Reverend Lyman Beecher, to settle in Cincinnati, Ohio. The Hartford Female Seminary continued in operation after Beecher's departure, and it was expanded in 1863 with an addition that included a room for physical exercise, something that Catherine Beecher had long championed. In fact, she wrote a book on physiology and calisthenics published in 1856. The school seems to have closed in 1888 because in that year it sold its building at 100 Pratt Street to the Goodwill Club, what's today called the Boys and Girls Club. It continued to be home to the Goodwill Club until 1911, when the organization moved to a new building adjacent to Keeney Tower. At that time, the old Female Seminary building was occupied by the Morse Business College, under the direction of Principal E. H. Morse, who in an advertisement presented himself, quote, in his characteristic attitude of earnest appeal to the high ideals of manhood and womanhood, unquote. Over a decade earlier, Morse had taken over the Bryant and Stratton Business College, which had started in 1860. The Morse School of Business would later move to the corner of Ann and Asylum Streets, where it would continue to exist until 1999. As for the old 1820s seminary building, it was finally torn down in 1917 and replaced by the temporary store of G. Fox and Company. This large department store's building on Main Street had just been gutted in a devastating fire, so the temporary store was erected very quickly to serve customers until its new facility was completed. That new facility was, of course, the G. Fox building that still remains a Hartford landmark today. Once the new Main Street building was completed, the former temporary store on Pratt Street was rented out to other businesses. This temporary store building had an L shape, as shown in a section from the 1917 Atlas of Hartford on the left. The south end of the L faced Pratt, while the west end faced Trumbull Street. As shown in the image of Trumbull Street in the center, the building's Pratt and Trumbull Street facades were nearly identical. Nestled between these two wings, right at the corner of Pratt and Trumbull, was an early 19th century building that by this time was known as the Clifton Hotel. It had recently also been known as the Pratt Street House. In 1924, a fire destroyed the G. Fox-owned Pratt and Trumbull Street building. The remains of that building and the old Clifton Hotel were soon demolished by G. Fox head Moses Fox and replaced by a new building designed by Buck and Sheldon of Hartford, which was completed in 1926. This photograph, taken during the construction of the Hartford Civic Center in 1972, shows the 1926 building's long Trumbull Street side. It soon became known as the Standard Building and has the address today of 242 Trumbull Street. Soon, just across Pratt Street to the south, the Steiger Building was erected in 1926 to 1928. Both buildings still stand today, flanking the west end of Pratt Street. 242 Trumbull was enlarged in 1988 with the addition of 4 new floors. This expansion was the work of the architectural firm of Russell Gibson Von Dolen of Farmington, which also added a pedestrian bridge above Trumbull Street that connected to the Hartford Civic Center and has since been removed. This expansion also included an addition to the rear of the Standard Building that would greatly impact buildings on the north side of Pratt. I'll talk about that impact a little later in this video. Returning again to the 1869 Atlas, there was one other building that the map makers chose to label. Instead of being a bank or a school, this one was a business establishment. Talcott and Post's wholesale and retail dry goods and paper hanging business, which had opened in 1850 on the corner of Main and Pratt Streets. In 1860, the firm acquired that building on the corner, as well as the adjacent building on Pratt Street that is labeled in the 1869 Atlas. That Pratt Street building, which would eventually be enlarged, was historically notable because between 1867 and 1880, its western half was home to the Hartford Courant newspaper. As for Talcott and Post, the latter left the store in 1881, and Talcott continued at the corner location on his own until he retired in 1889. The storefront was then leased to the new firm of Sage, Allen and Company, which in less than a decade would erect its own building on Main Street across from the east end of Pratt Street, a facade that still exists today. This is a section of the 1880 Atlas of Hartford. It shows that on the north side of Pratt Street at that time, between the Hartford Female Seminary on the west and the Talcott and Post-owned buildings on the east, there were 5 houses. Just a year later, in 1881, a new building was completed just to the rear of the house in the middle of this row. This was the church of the First Unitarian Society. The Romanesque revival structure, designed by Hartford architect John C. Mead, could also serve as an auditorium for an audience of over 500 people, so the building was also known as Unity Hall. This photograph shows Unity Hall on the right, while on the left is the house that stood right in front of it. A decade later, in 1892, the Unitarian Society replaced the house in front with a 5-story office and commercial block designed in the Romanesque style by John J. Dwyer. Unity Hall in the rear was taken down in 1924, but the Unity building still exists today. The ground floor was much altered, however, in 1928 in the Jacobean style, which is why the year 1928 was carved above the front door. Just west of the Unity building is what appears to be the only survivor of Pratt's early 19th century days as a residential street, the Spencer House. It was built in 1830 by Charles Spencer, who had a wholesale grocery business on Commerce Street. The house was built during the transition from the Federal to the Greek Revival styles. But this is not actually the original Spencer house, but rather a replica of that old house's facade. As this picture shows, the Unity Building on the right, Spencer House in the center, and Cook Building on the left are all connected in the rear to a much larger building that was erected in the late 1980s as an annex to the building at 242 Trumbull Street, which I mentioned earlier. At that time, the original Spencer House was demolished and replaced with a recreation. The house had gone through a lot of alterations over the years, and Tyler Smith of Smith Edwards, the Hartford architectural firm that designed the alterations to the old buildings along Pratt Street, estimated that only 15% of the original structure remained. For that reason, he chose to recreate the building based on old photographs rather than attempt to restore it. As I mentioned, between the Spencer House and 242 Trumbull is the three-story Cook Building, which dates to 1888. It was built by Charles M. Cook and, like the Unity Building, has an altered ground floor facade. The Cook Building was later owned by Jerome E. Sage. He had been an original partner in Sage Allen and Company, but in 1903, a few years after the store erected its building on Main Street, he had separated from the partners and the following year had returned to business with his own women's furnishings and dry goods store in the Cook Building on Pratt Street. After his death in 1919, the business had been continued by his son-in-law and daughter, Mr. and Mrs. James H. Coburn. In 1924, the Coburns sold the building to Wise Smith and Company, which for some years had been amassing contiguous properties along both the west side of Main Street and the north side of Pratt Street. Isidore Wise, the head of Wise Smith and Company, opened the six-story department store on Main Street just around the corner from Pratt Street in 1897. Over the next 3 decades, Wise aggressively expanded his store and acquired nearby properties until he became one of the largest holders of undivided real estate downtown. By 1930, the store had reached its full size. Wise Smith and Company closed in 1954, and the building, which later served as a Corvette store and then was known as the American Airlines Building, survives today. Besides his store on Main Street, Wise played a major role in developing Pratt Street. As the rise of commercial structures like the Unity and Cook buildings would indicate, Pratt Street had been developing as a retail center, and it was becoming particularly known for specialty shops catering to women. As this 1917 advertisement indicates, quote, "Along Pratt Street are located many of the leading specialty shops of the city, including shops for women's wear, jewelry, opticians, photographers, furriers, milliners, a stationery store, a business school, a circulating library, a linen shop, a coal dealer, cleaners and dyers, department store, shoe store, etc." Pratt Street has long had the reputation of being one of the busiest streets in the city, and its shops enjoy the distinction of serving the discriminating public, those who look for quality combined with the smartest creations in the various lines represented, unquote. It was right at that time that Isidore Wise was actively acquiring properties along the north side of Pratt Street. His first move in that direction came in 1899, as reflected in this section of the Sanborn Hartford Atlas of 1900. Wise had started using the building to the west, directly behind his department store, as a storehouse. The building, built in the early 1880s, when it served as a coffin factory, was also situated north of and behind the Pratt Street building that I earlier mentioned had once been owned by Talcott and Post, and had once been home to the Hartford Courant. In 1905, the storehouse was destroyed in a fire, and the owner of the property, Connecticut State Supreme Court Justice William Hammersley, soon constructed a new building on the site that extended all the way to Pratt Street. The sliver of property just west of this, which seems to have been part of an earlier house on the spot, had been acquired by Wise in 1905. In 1917, he purchased the Hammersley property as well. This photograph shows these buildings in that year. Wise's 1905 sliver is on the left. When he acquired the adjacent Hammersley building in 1917, the ground floor tenants were New England Furriers at 36 Pratt Street and the O'Connor Coal and Supply Company at 32 Pratt Street. Around the same time, he purchased the adjacent Goodwin lot to the west, on which stood one of the old Pratt Street houses. And just west of that, he also acquired Unity Hall and the Unity Building. This made him the largest property holder downtown at the time. And he still wasn't quite done, because as I mentioned, in 1924, he bought the Cook Building from the heirs of Jerome E. Sage. As we know, the Cook and Unity buildings and a recreation of the Spencer House facade survive today, but Wise would replace the Hammersley building and the house on the Goodwin lot, which is shown in this photograph next to the Unity building. The photo also shows the now lost Unity Church to the rear. This photo shows the two new buildings that Wise constructed. These structures, both designed by Hartford architect Isaac A. Allen, Jr., were kept to 2 floors each because Wise wanted to maintain Pratt Street's more intimate character and its focus on specialty shops. The Goodwin House was replaced in 1918 by the building at 52 to 54 Pratt Street, and the Hammersley building was replaced in 1922 by the building at 40 to 44 Pratt Street. Part of this building connected through to the Wise & Smith Company store on Main Street, which is why the store name appeared above one of the entrances. It later connected to the Corvette store that succeeded Wise Smith. These two Allen-designed buildings survive today. Like the neighboring Unity building, Spencer House and Cook building, the 1918 building at 52 to 54 Pratt is now connected to the rear of the long annex of 242 Trumbull Street. Also, as part of that project, the alley that once existed between the Allen and Unity buildings was filled with a new entrance to the annex designed by Tyler Smith that has an address of 64 Pratt Street. I haven't been able to find many historic images of the south side of Pratt Street, west of the Society for Savings building. This section, from the bird's eye view of Hartford of 1877, shows the row of houses that stood here at that time. One of them was the old house owned by C.W. Huntington at 29 to 31 Pratt Street. A picture of this house was taken just before it was torn down in 1897. As reported in the Hartford Courant at that time, Mr. Huntington, who had lived in the house for 32 years, had been told about its history by the previous owner, Edward Goodwin. It had once stood in the vicinity of the old State House, and there was even a mistaken tradition that it was Connecticut's original 1719 State House. It was actually likely built in the late 1700s, and it was moved to Pratt Street around the time that it was first opened up in 1814. After being used for some time as a schoolhouse, it was then rotated 90 degrees and its first floor converted into a store for the sale of West India goods. Later, it became a private residence again and was purchased by Huntington in 1865. New floors had been added over older floors, and when the earlier floors were uncovered, one revealed ink spots left from the building's days as a school, and another had been stained from sugar, molasses, and rum from its days as a store. Today, on the south side of Pratt Street, between Society for Savings on the east and the Steiger building, which faces Trumbull Street to the west, there are 5 buildings, all erected during the quarter century between 1907 and 1922. First, there's the 2-story Gothic-style building at 45 Pratt Street, designed by Isaac A. Allen, Jr. and built in 1919. Next is the 8-story Hudson building at 57 Pratt Street, built in 1922 to the plans of Edward M. Stone of Hartford. This was built by the Hudson Estate on the site of the old Barzillai Hudson House. Born in 1794, Barzillai Hudson's grandfather of the same name had been co-owner of the Hartford Courant from 1779 to 1815. The younger Barzillai and his brother William owned a dry goods, furniture, and auctioneer business called B&W Hudson. For decades in the early 19th century, the brothers auctioned everything from building lots and fruit trees to carriages, cows, and railway stock. They also sold real estate all over the city. Barzillai Hudson, who died in 1871, was also the first president of the Phoenix Mutual Life Insurance Company and a founder and early vice president and director of the American School for the Deaf. Next to the Hudson Building is the three-story Stevens Building, built in 1907, but remodeled under the direction of Lester B. Scheide of Hartford in 1937. Next to that is the five-story Dillon Building of 1899. Yet another work by Isaac A. Allen, Jr. It features elaborate brick, limestone, terracotta, and cast iron decoration. The last building before the Steiger Building is the five-story Stearns Building, 75 Pratt Street, which is the building that replaced the old colonial-era Huntington House I described earlier. The brick Stearns Building, designed by an unknown architect, also has limestone and terracotta ornamentation. Pratt Street's association with specialty shops and services catering to women continued through the mid-20th century. In 1964, the Hartford Courant noted that the street had 28 beauty shops, 10 women's clothing stores, 9 furriers, 4 dressmakers, and 2 milliners. In 1949, as had been done earlier in 1917, a group of merchants on the street banded together to produce a series of ads touting the advantages of the street as a whole. Describing Pratt as the street of specialty stores, the ads noted the street's wide selection of high-quality yet affordable merchandise and the personalized attention that specialty stores could give to their customers. By the late 1950s, during an intense period of redevelopment in downtown Hartford, there were calls for sprucing up Pratt Street, and in September 1959, an experiment was even tried that transformed Pratt into a pedestrian-only mall for a day. Some even considered the possibilities of making the change permanent. Over the next few decades, though, the city's retail district experienced a decline, and there were many projects contemplated over the years to modernize and revitalize Pratt Street. I already mentioned the changes that eventually did come when the annex to 242 Trumbull Street was built, including the recreation of the Spencer House facade. Another part of that revitalization project was a fundraising effort by local boosters to sell bricks for $45 each that could be inscribed with contributors' messages up to 28 characters and spaces. In 1989, the message bricks were used to pave the sidewalks along Pratt Street. Those messages can still be found along the street today. Redevelopment plans for Pratt Street continue even as I make this video, with nearly 100 new apartments recently opening on the upper levels of 99 Pratt and plans to construct dorms for UConn's Hartford branch in the annex building at 64 Pratt. I mentioned Wise, Smith & Company earlier, and the video on the left will give a lot more info about that old Hartford department store. The video on the right is about Sage Allen & Company, which I also mentioned in this video. Thanks for watching.